Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Nicholas Gvosdev, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, phoning in from an undisclosed location.
I hope it's a safe location, Nick. This is Tatiana Serafin, also co-host, welcoming today back to the Doorstep, Colin Dueck, professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and non-resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute. So excited to have Colin back to review where we are with Biden-Harris and their foreign policy, how it's resonating at the doorstep. Colin is always a special guest. And before we get to him though, Nick, I want to remind everyone, we have a book talk coming up on March 15th, 6 p.m. Go to carnegiecouncil.org for more information. The book talk will be with Eric Schwartzel, about Hollywood and how Hollywood is controlled by China of all places. Colin, in a minute, is going to talk to us about the China factor and the danger from China and how we need to up our game. And I very much look forward to that and very much look forward to having you back in the studio, Nick. Thank you so much for coming back to the doorstep, Colin. It's been almost a year since you were on. From what we talked about last year to today, I think is going to be so interesting. Last year, the topic was assessing Trump's legacy on Biden's foreign policy. And this year, the names are the same. Trump is launching Truth Social, maybe on Monday. There's a lot of talk about what Biden is doing out in the world because there's so much happening in the world. Last year, we graded, after I think we were at the 60-day mark, we graded how the foreign policy was reverting to domestic policy. And we're back now. We have a year's worth of lots happening in the world. And certainly this week, I think there's a lot of tension. We can start in many, many different places. So I do want to talk about Canada and what's going on in Canada with you because you are a native Canadian back in the day. But let's start, though, with something bigger because minute by minute, the situation changes with the standoff with Moscow over Ukraine. And I don't know, I want to hear from you. What do you think about how the Biden team has approached the situation? From your point of view, is the message that they're trying to send to Main Street America working? I saw a provocative headline a couple minutes ago on BBC. U.S. Kremlin backers seek to undermine Joe Biden. U.S. Kremlin backers. And I thought, really? What can you explain to us what is going on in some of the voices who think that Biden shouldn't be going into Ukraine?
Sure. Well, and thanks for having me back. I'm delighted to be here. So just on the Ukraine crisis, I think the Biden administration is getting some things right, not everything, but I think that, there has to be a kind of firm response to Putin's threats. Then the question is what exactly to do about it. Biden, at times there's been a little bit mixed messaging. Is a minor incursion okay? What's the definition of a minor incursion? That was a little bit of a unforced error. And of course, it's just a lot of this is just beyond Biden's control. I mean, that's one of the things that we're seeing. It's beyond any American's control. Whether the Germans, for example, are willing to step up and take part in a kind of coordinated, muscular response is not at all obvious. So, and that's a trend with Germany going back many years. I think what you're seeing that's interesting is foreign policy now more and more, some of these divisions cut across party lines. So whereas, let's say 20 years ago, it was kind of left versus right, I think now you're seeing some people in both parties, particularly in Congress, who want a really kind of robust US response to Russia. But you're also seeing a sort of vocal constituency on both left and right that is saying, hey, I mean, let's cool it. If anything, worried about the possibility that this could escalate into conflict. You see some progressives offering those kinds of warnings. And then, of course, on the right, you've had some voices. There was a piece in the New York Times a few days ago. I don't know if you saw that. Some national conservatives speaking out and saying that really the U.S. has to be less hawkish on Russia. If you recall, one of the distinctive things about Trump's message from the start was his argument that the US should have better relations with Russia. I mean, he said this back in 2015, 2016. It was no secret. He ran on that. And but at the same time, the Republican Party has a lot of Russia hawks. So there never has been a resolution of that. I think Republicans are divided, especially as you get out further out of kind of elite circles. You have a certain percentage of people that want to see a hard line on Russia. You have a certain percentage that don't. I think the public opinion polls, by the way, show that conservatives and Republicans still tend to, on average, be cool on Putin's Russia. But there is this interesting trend of at least a minority of conservatives that that really aren't. And probably the same thing on the left.
That's a fascinating thing you're bringing up, Colin, because you are seeing these cleavages, and they're coming from different perspectives. So you have, as you noted, among conservatives and Republicans, you have a cleavage between kind of a people that might still adhere to a policy position that would have been advocated by the late Senator McCain, very suspicious of Russia, push back on Russia, extend the zone of the Euro-Atlantic community, and then a Tucker Carlson or even a Senator Hawley questioning to what extent is this, continuing to push against Russia makes sense for U.S. interests. In some cases, it's a sense that culturally or politically we might have some common ground. We've seen the concern from people like Elbridge Colby that this is a distraction from the real challenge, which is China. And as you've noted on the left as well, a progressive group within Democratic circles, which kind of revives the old anti-interventionist group, with also saying, "Hey, this is a distraction from other issues." And one of the things I think from the doorstep perspective is watching the concern about U.S. action being everyone is in favor of strong U.S. action against Russia over Ukraine until there are domestic costs, economic costs. And we've seen this, Boeing saying, wait a minute, we get our titanium from Russia, and oil refiners saying, look, Russia is the second major foreign source of oil for our refineries. So let's think through this. I mean, do you think that this is something that you have identified, and in your work, you've tried to look at different trends, groupings within foreign policy? Do you think we're moving into, starting with Ukraine as the example, are we moving into a situation where there isn't going to be a, quote, Republican or, quote, Democratic position, but we're going to see kind of a centrist Republican Democratic position, and then, I don't know how you would frame it, but a progressive Democratic position, which may find more in common with, come home America Republican position? I mean, as a scholar of American foreign policy, where do you see this going?
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. I mean, you have factions within each party that in some ways have more in common with some factions on the other side of the aisle, even though they don't necessarily like each other very much. Those who would call themselves non-interventionist or advocates of restraint or anti-war. I mean, they're clearly trying to build a left-right coalition on this. You mentioned the economic angle. I think it's very interesting, especially with inflation climbing in the United States. It's clear that the White House is sensitive to the idea that sanctions could backfire if you have to impose these strict sanctions, and then you're dealing with higher oil and gas prices, and then that drives up inflation. That's going to be a problem heading into the midterms. And if anything, I think in a lot of European countries, that's even more of a powerful constraint. So we're set up to impose stronger sanctions depending on what the Russians do. But actually, it sounds as though we've ruled out a lot in terms of how stringent these sanctions might be.
Speaking to at the doorstep, my electric bill was skyrocketed. And in the little footnote, because I read all the footnotes, it said it was because, energy prices, global energy prices were up, resources are, and if you read it, if one read it, if a consumer read it, they would understand that all of this is interlinked. But for the most part, I don't know that, Main Street really understands or kind of understands how it's going to impact them. The article that I mentioned in BBC that cited, I think it was Pew study that said that most Americans, didn't even know what was going on with Russia and Ukraine and the whole situation. So it's interesting, from a perspective, if you read some newspapers, you would think that that is the only thing that is happening in the world. But on a doorstep level, I don't know that the impact of the situation in Russia, Ukraine is quite hitting to the degree that, the Biden administration is saying that this is, such an important issue for us and we have to kind of take it on. What do you think is the disconnect? What is happening there?
Well, I think you're right. There is a disconnect, and that's nothing new. And by the way, I think part of what's going on is the White House is trying to make it crystal clear that they're not going to be surprised this time, the way they were surprised last summer in Afghanistan. So in other words, if something shocking happens, right, if Russian tanks actually roll over the border into Ukraine, they haven't been caught by surprise. I think that's probably a very vivid and unpleasant memory from last summer. Now, your point is exactly right, which is that for the most part, foreign policy is never really the top concern of the general public, and with rare exceptions, right? Maybe moments like after 9/11 or something like that, after Pearl Harbor. But, Russia and Ukraine is not a top priority. Inflation actually is much more of a priority, right? And so if you think about, for example, last summer, Biden's approval rating started to go down over the course of the summer. And those of us who did foreign policy sort of looked at the numbers and thought, well, there must be a correlation to what happened in Afghanistan. And there is a correlation, but whether there's a causation is a separate question. I think people who looked at the polls actually said the single most important thing was probably domestic economic, inflation. And then it just so happened that it was rising at about the same time as this fiasco in Afghanistan. And so, Biden has been hit by a lot of domestic frustrations, and that's the most important thing. It's the sense that the shutdown never ends, the pandemic never ends, inflation's gone up. There's just kind of it's like we're living in this era of bad feeling. It's like you think about compared to 100 years ago. I think, was it James Monroe was the era of good feeling? Well, people just they don't seem terribly happy. Something like 70% say the country's on the wrong track. And so whatever it was that got Biden elected November 2020, he's now in a position where his numbers are not great. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Most of it is domestic economic. And then Afghanistan just feeds into that as a sense of, we just can't seem to get anything right, but I don't think it's mainly about foreign policy.
Colin, something you said with us last year, which I think resonates about, as you said, that foreign policy is not the main driver, it's domestic, but also something that you said to us last year, which is that the Biden administration has many people on the team below the president who really believe in foreign policy as a series of declaratory statements, right? That you just declare something and you're done. So we had said, Russia, don't invade Ukraine. And therefore, and hashtag don't invade Ukraine. And somehow that's done. Whereas, we're dealing with, players in the international system that are looking at hard power, whether it's military power or hard economic power. I mean, is there a chance, or again, as a student or as a teacher and observer of U.S. foreign policy and trends, I mean, are you concerned that we could be heading for kind of a perfect moment? Perfect moment, let me take that back. Perhaps not a perfect moment, but a perfect storm where these unmet domestic expectations, inflation, hit foreign policy crises, and then we enter into a narrative that America's on the decline and things can't get better. I mean, walk us through, putting on your professorial hat of what the trends that you're looking at with this, with a foreign policy team that has a track record of, in the past, during the Obama years, of being very declarative, but not always matching that declaration with concrete action. Whether it's now with Ukraine, as we saw, the the robust sanctions bill in the Senate is now going to be replaced by a kind of non-binding advisory, and very strong sanctions, and then they get watered. We now know all the things that are off the table, so on and so forth. I mean, where is this heading? Where do you think this may be headed?
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who's been, he's got decades of experience as an American diplomat, and he described the Biden team, and I think he was more than willing to give it a chance, but he described it as the best Senate staff ever when it comes to foreign policy. I don't think he meant it as a compliment. I think what he meant was you have a team that at the heart of it, it's people who know Biden going back many years. There's a comfort level personally. They get along. They are very sensitive to his needs. And by the way, that's going to include his domestic political needs, right? And that's not unusual. That's often what you get at the core of any White House team. But, Biden is somebody who over the years, he is a politician. He's a career politician. He's been there for half a century, right? And he's not, for all the talk about his foreign policy expertise, I think he's mainly interested in holding together a Democratic Party coalition on domestic issues, getting as many legislative wins as he can, and avoiding political disaster. I mean, that is his priority as a coalitional leader. So foreign policy is not going to be top of the list, and so you have an approach where it's almost like you're saying, it's almost like you're sending RSVPs to various foreign dictators saying, I regret to inform you that we cannot participate in this crisis at the moment. And they don't care. I mean, they're gonna take advantage of whatever gaps they can find. They don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. They don't care if your name is Obama or Bush or Trump or Biden. They will look for weaknesses and take advantage. I think that's certainly true of Putin. It's true of China. It's true of North Korea and Iran. And the nightmare scenario that you mentioned, to me, and again, this isn't unique to Biden. I mean, this has been building for a while. The nightmare scenario is you face multiple crises at once. Let's say, for the sake of argument, one in Taiwan, one in Ukraine, and then you could even, if you like, you could throw in something in either the Korean Peninsula or the Middle East. And various authoritarian regimes realize that they can feed off these crises to take advantage of an American alliance system and an American political system that is distracted and divided and unsure of itself. And this could get ugly. I mean, there are people who, run war game simulations at the Pentagon, and it doesn't end well for the United States. I mean, you can imagine a scenario. I don't think this is too far-fetched. You can imagine a scenario where we actually enter into armed conflict with several of these powers at once, and it doesn't go well. And if that happens, it's going to make what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan look like peanuts. Frankly, you could have events, you could have casualties that dwarf either of those two conflicts.
So
it just reminds us. Sorry, Tatiana. Before I turn to you on that, it just reminds us of the scenario that Admiral Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman outlined for us last year on their book about 2034, which did not end well for the United States. And Colin, your assessment here tracks with what Dov Zakheim is worrying about what he calls the triple challenge and this challenge of simultaneity. But Tatiana, over to you to the next set of questions.
No, I mean, let's stay on this challenge because, Colin, you mentioned last year this idea that there was a lot of rhetoric and no action, right? And I'm gonna just ask because, I saw Reuters reporting that Biden was asking for $770 plus billion for a defense budget for next year for fiscal 23. And last week, I believe it was, his administration put out a commitment to bolster the Indo-Pacific region and alliances to try to counter the China threat, the China threat, including sometime, in the next few months, creating an Indo-Pacific economic framework. Is that all talk? I mean, to me, that sounds like they're noticing that it takes money to be present on the world stage and to say that America is going to lead. And it seems to me that, America has been, to your point about Germany, the only one leading on Ukraine. I mean, unless I'm reading the situation wrong. So it seems that, they are speaking it, but they're also trying to act on it. I'm looking for the optimistic thread here.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, look, there is some action, and I do want to give them some credit when they do take action. I actually would have expected defense spending to be lower compared to what we talked about a year ago. I think partly Congress pushed back, actually bipartisan, and said we want to keep defense at a certain level, but it hasn't gone down as much as you'd think, given how much domestic spending has gone up. So there are trade-offs. Obviously, that means we have more debt, but defense hasn't been pushed down to the extent that it might have been. And on the Pacific, yeah, there's a number of good things going on. I mean, absolutely. I think the Quad, I think the Australian sub deal. There's a list of things. I think trying to get allies to work together, coordinate against China, and downplaying some of these trade disputes is positive. I wrote about that during the Trump years too. That's what we needed to do, right? So I'm happy to see some of that. I think in Ukraine, I mean, you mentioned that, of course, it is true that the U.S. has been more assertive, and I think what Biden's finding out is that the Germans can be difficult, whether or not you're left, right, or center from an American point of view. I mean, they just have a different way of looking at things. The Germans don't see, I mean, Nick can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the Germans see Russia as much of a threat, actually, as some other Western countries do. I think clearly they depend heavily on their energy supply from Russia. But there's also kind of a philosophical difference, which is the Germans see themselves in the middle of Europe. They sort of see themselves equidistant in a way. They feel like they have a better understanding of Russia. There's certainly a sense of historic guilt or legacy going back to the 40s of, the last thing we want is any sort of conflict with Russia. We don't want German weapons in Ukraine for all kinds of obvious reasons. That just doesn't, we don't like the optics, right? So that's a kind of moral, historical, political legacy that's very powerful. It's distinctly German. And it does, again, that's an example of where it doesn't really matter who the American president is. I think that's what we're dealing with. There are some European allies that have stepped up. I would say the British, the Poles, the Baltic states are being more robust in their response, along with the US. And of course, the French always have that distinctive desire to lead and to assert French independence and French leadership in a very interesting way. So I think Macron is worth keeping an eye on as well.
I think, Colin, you raised a really good point, which is something you've been warning about in your writings, Lawrence Friedman also, that this expectation that this, that everything was just Trump, that once Trump was gone, that everything would change and it would be sweetness and light. And both you and Friedman and others said, first of all, Trump represented a trend in American politics, which is beyond just Donald Trump, but that also, as you just noted now, some of these issues are endemic to some of our core European partners. And the fact that Germany has switched from a center-right to a center-left government hasn't changed them. So I think that's something, overemphasizing the idea that all the transatlantic and trans-Pacific problems could be laid solely at Donald Trump's door, and that there weren't other issues at play, I think really is something. I don't know, Tatiana, if you are wanting to switch to Canada at this point, just
well, I'm gonna say Trump is part of that story too. I mean, he's been tweeting support for the Freedom Convoy, so let's have a nice thread. You say, that he's gone or in its sweetness and light. No, he's still there, and he is commenting on everything from the convoy to Russia. So and I think that it wasn't just the convoy in Canada, but all the copycat convoys. I can't believe I actually said that sentence. Copycat convoys in New Zealand and in France.
France, yeah.
Yeah. So what I think there is, to your point, Colin, earlier in this conversation, this, unhappy feeling is kind of everywhere, and it's sprouting up in these protests. But I do think that they're being driven by something else, by other players, by people with other agendas. And partly, it might be to destabilize Biden and ahead of the midterms, or any sort of, internationalist feeling. I mean, what is your sense of these protests?
Yeah, I'll, as you know, I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Saskatchewan, actually, which is not exactly Justin Trudeau country. So in a weird way, that gives me an ability to, I think a lot of the people that I grew up with, it's closer to the truckers than to Trudeau. So look, Canada's a law-abiding country, and I mean, you're going to have a majority of people at the end of the day who say you can't just break the law, and you certainly can't you can't do it violently. But I do think what you're seeing in Canada is what you're seeing in a lot of Western countries, which is just sort of a pandemic fatigue, a shutdown fatigue, a feeling that the federal government has overreached, has overregulated, can't stop bossing people around. And the fact that it's centered on kind of an Eastern set of cities and authorities that tend to be liberal, it feels like a very polarized situation right now. Maybe not to the same extent as the United States, but it actually resonates with, in some ways, the feelings that I grew up with. There is, I think, a feeling that somebody like Trudeau, who after his father, Pierre Trudeau, was a longtime liberal prime minister in the 70s and early 80s. My impression is that Justin Trudeau has overreached and he's cracking down a little too hard. And I suspect the reasons are in declaring this emergency state that he's thinking maybe about his own father in 1970, trying to do something similar against Quebec militants. And actually, in the end, that worked for Pierre Trudeau. So the son, Justin, may have that in his mind as a positive memory, although I think it may turn out to be a false comparison. The other thing he may be thinking of is January 6th, right, from last year. And, if this is something similar, if that's what he's thinking, then he's going to react very, very aggressively to sort of remind everybody that, this is Canada, right? It's not a country of, if you think about Canadian founding principles are peace, order, and good government, not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the notion of order is very strong. And you'll notice that with this Freedom Convoy, for all the frustrations in Ottawa and with the convoy, I'm not aware that it's been mass urban violence. I'm not aware that that's actually happened. It's basically been peaceful. And I think that most people in the country, according to the polls, are saying that although they don't support the law breaking, they actually have some sympathy with the notion that the shutdown has overreached. So it's a very delicate situation, has to be carefully handled. I don't think Trudeau's doing that. I think he's reacting. I think he's overreacting, to tell you the truth. And I think there's a bit of an echo chamber effect going on, where he's probably talking to people on really just on one side of this who are reinforcing his own instincts. And I can tell you, in the prairies, this is not going to play very well. And a lot of parts of rural Ontario and British Columbia as well.
It's a fascinating thing, both what you've just said and how also, as Tatiana pointed out, the copycat convoys, that there does seem to be a certain type of, I don't want to say imitation factor per se, but that, the French convoy, they were flying Canadian flags. That there's this sense of, in this era of bad feelings, that people are looking to developments in other countries. Tatiana, I think this points to what you said about the globalization of news and the globalization of memes and of protest. And so that element, the fact that Trudeau may be looking through this through a lens of what happened in the United States on January 6th and looking at kind of U.S. parallels to it is also fascinating for what this says about how people get news, how they process information. And then finally, because I can't resist giving a plug to yet another Doorstep guest, that we had on after you last year, Colin, David Yermak, one of the features too of the Canadian government's efforts to try to bring this under control is to go after cryptocurrency and to go after ways of how groups that are organizing the protests might finance this. And of course, David Yermak was talking last year with us about the potential game-changing nature of cryptocurrencies that are delinked from governments. But one thing about the protests as well, and again, looking forward, and I think tying all of this to some of the comments you said previously, really this era of bad feelings, at what point, and also implicit, I think, in your question, Tatiana, is at what point do these types of movements, but also the way in which governments and elites are handling them, is really leading to an erosion of the social trust that democracies need in order to be able to be stable and in order to function in times of crisis? Because it really does look like what we would have thought of as public health measures get politicized. We're seeing it now that as mask mandates come down in the U.S., people want to keep the mandates because they see that as part of their political identity. What is this, again, asking you to put on your long-term historian's hat, what does this mean for the health of the liberal democratic model in the U.S., in Canada, in France, in other parts of Europe and Asia? What are you thinking as you look at all this moving forward?
Well, right, there is a kind of transnational element to it, and I would say that Trudeau is a great example of somebody who clearly sees himself as part of a transnational liberal set of values or norms or even political forces. The danger is when liberal internationalists across borders start to think that the only challenges they're facing are basically neo-fascists. I mean, that's then you get an overreaction, and you're going to just alienate people because you're not admitting that there can be such a thing as an honest disagreement. I think what I'm not denying there is such a thing as the far right, and there are connections between the far right. There are groups, for example, in Europe, Golden Dawn of Greece, right? They are creepy. That is a creepy bunch of characters. Yeah. But much of what we're seeing, I think, is actually just something that's just more populist in a looser sense, which is its anti-establishment feeling. It's a feeling that the current order just isn't functioning terribly well. It's not especially competent, right? It's not especially competent on basic day-to-day governance, whether it's economics, crime, inflation, national security, immigration, you name it. That doesn't have to be far right or far left, but it can pop up in different ways. I mean, Bernie Sanders tapped into that, and I think he actually had a huge impact in altering the Democratic Party over a period of years. So it can pop up on the left, it can pop up on the right, it can pop up in the middle, it can pop up in different countries in different ways. I don't think that Canadian populism is exactly the same as American populism, and I don't think that American populism is exactly the same as the forms that it takes in Europe, but there are these similarities. And I guess what I would say is if existing authorities that call themselves centrist, that are sort of center right, center left, if they cannot competently manage real world problems, then these populist movements are just going to continue to pop up over and over again. And why wouldn't they? Right? I mean, whose fault is it? I mean, what would you expect? So it is up to those in charge to provide competent governance to make sure that the system doesn't enter into a period of true breakdown. And if what instead happens is that people in charge really respond with just kind of verbal denunciations of anybody who agrees with them, of anybody who disagrees with them, and says, well, this is far right, it's far left, it's extreme, it's beyond the pale. In some of these cases, you're dealing with large scale resentments or that actually have some legitimacy. I mean, I think you saw this, for example, several years ago with Merkel. I think she mismanaged the migration crisis of, 2015. And then actually a skillful politician that she got the message and she adapted and she moved on that, because we were seeing in public opinion polls in Germany that a solid majority of Germans, after a few months, had said, we need, basically, we would like a coffee break now when it comes to mass migration into Germany. And so they kind of quietly managed it. If authorities in power do not manage these concerns, somebody else will. Somebody else will. The voters will bring in somebody else to manage them. That's a lesson.
Well, and I think the danger is not only that the voters will bring in somebody else, but that you will have regimes, because we do live in a world of disinformation and tech disruption. So you will have international players kind of feeding the disinformation loop. And I certainly, Russia and China are top of my list that I'm watching what's coming out of them in terms of tech disruptions, disinformation disruptions in elections, not only here, but everywhere. I have to ask the question, because I was one of my questions. Are you concerned about this new China-Russia strategic no limits partnership? We're talking here about our liberal norms, and they're kind of claiming that there's something different, that they have a new interpretation of the international order. Do you think people are buying this?
I mean, I'm very concerned about it. I think if China and Russia, so it's not a formal alliance, and Nick knows this better than anybody, but it's a partnership that's pretty intimidating. I mean, relations have only gotten better over the years. They agree on quite a bit. They have a sort of coordination on military matters, on just fundamentally resenting the notion of an American-led order. And they're trying to, I think, do several things. They're trying to stave off interference in their own affairs, but they're also trying to provide a little bit of cover for one another as they each push out into their own sphere of influence. And if you look at it on a map, I mean, it doesn't even take anything other than a child to see that that's a pretty powerful combination, Russia and China together. Two great powers that are authoritarian, China in particular, with an economy that's now roughly comparable to America's, both nuclear armed. There's a lot of confidence on both sides of that they are winning, actually, and that they may very well continue to win in the future. So I think we need to take it dead seriously. Now, how exactly, what exactly the U.S. should do in response is an interesting question. There's more than one interesting recommendation out there, but do we need to take it seriously? I think absolutely.
So to go back to what we talked about last year, we asked you to grade Biden's foreign policy, and last year you gave him a C on the migration and a to be determined. So now you have a year's worth of data. What grade would you give the Biden-Harris team
on foreign policy?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say that a lot of what's happened over the last year, I think that the Afghan withdrawal, whether or not people feel like it had to happen at a macro level, I mean, it was pretty disastrous in terms of how it was managed. I think even sympathetic supporters felt that was the case. And I think that there is a pattern here, even apart from Afghanistan, which Nick mentioned, and I do find it worrying, which is I'm just going to be very blunt about this. I'm not sure that foreign aggressors are afraid of Joe Biden. I'm not sure they're afraid of him, and I think they need to be. I think it's just that simple. I think they need to be afraid, and I'm using that word deliberately. There needs to be a fear in authoritarian capitals like Moscow and Beijing and Tehran and Pyongyang that if you mess with the United States and its allies, you will pay a price for it. I'm not questioning the good intentions of, I know there's a lot of people on the Biden team that are very sincere and are working hard, but I am not sure I'm not sure that these dictators overseas are in that condition that they need to be right now. And if they're not, deterrence could break down. So, we'll have to see how it plays out. I guess I can't really give the Biden team a terrific grade right now. I don't think it's been a great year. I'm hopeful that this works, right? Like, I don't want to see this fail. I would rather that we actually pull it together. but frankly, I'm concerned.
On that note, we will be looking forward to the midterm elections to see how much of this plays out and how much changes. And we hope to have you back next year for more discussion and assessment. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.